Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event, Icons and Iconoclasm in Religion, Politics, and the Academy, with our very special guest, Professor Carlos Eire. Our program this evening is the fifth of a fall series of programs at St. Olaf College on the topic of the presidential election in a nation in crisis, polarization, pandemic, prejudice. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event and the fall series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, special thanks go to Institute Assistant Director Eric Grell and Institute Student Assistant Jess Horst. Thanks also to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the St. Olaf Broadcast Media Services crew, to Andrea Galswick, Dan Hollering, and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications, and to Sarah Swenson and Madeline Rush of Goff Public. Finally, thanks to St. Olaf faculty and students who have integrated their study with our program this evening, particularly participants in the Public Affairs Conversation program, supported by the Institute, but also courses in St. Olaf's Religion Department, which is the co-sponsor of our event tonight, and Professor Leon Narvaez's Spanish classes on Latinx experiences in the United States. To remind our virtual audience members, you are invited to submit a question at any point during the discussion this evening by using the Participate tab on the streaming page. We are honored to have with us tonight Carlos Eire, who is the T. Lorison Riggs Professor of History and Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University. Professor Eire, who received his PhD from Yale in 1979, specializes in the social, intellectual, religious, and cultural history of late medieval and early modern Europe, with a focus on both the Protestant and Catholic Reformations, the history of popular piety, the history of the supernatural, and the history of death. Before joining the Yale faculty in 1996, he taught at St. John's University in Minnesota and the University of Virginia, and was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University for 2 years. He's the author of a number of important books: War Against the Idols, The Reformation of Worship from Erasmus to Calvin in 1986, From Madrid to Purgatory, The Art and Craft of Dying in 16th Century Spain, 1995, A Very Brief History of Eternity in 2010, Reformations, The Early Modern World, 2016, and The Life of Saint Teresa of Avila, a biography in 2019. He is also co-author of Jews, Christians, Muslims, An Introduction to Monotheistic Religions published in 1997. A past president of the Society for Reformation Research, he is currently researching attitudes toward miracles in the 16th and 17th centuries. His recent book, Reformations, won the R.R. Hawkins Prize for Best Book of the Year from the American Publishers Association, the award for Best Book in the Humanities, as well as the Yaroslav Pelikan Prize by Yale University Press. So, preeminent scholar of the Reformation is one important part of Professor Eire's identity. Another equally important part of his identity is his history as Cuban exile and American immigrant. Born and raised in Cuba as a child, Eire left Havana at the age of 11 in 1962 as part of the operation known as Peter Pan, Operación Pedro Pan, in which 14,000 unaccompanied young children were brought to the United States for fear of the new government under Fidel Castro. Eire spent his early life in the U.S., moving from foster home to foster home, never to see his father again, and only uniting with his mother upon her own later immigration to the United States. Eire recounts his young life experience in 2 brilliant memoirs. The first, Waiting for Snow in Havana, Confessions of a Cuban Boy, published in 2003, won the National Book Award in Nonfiction in the United States and has been translated into more than a dozen languages. The second memoir, Learning to Die in Miami, Confessions of a Refugee Boy, published in 2010, also received very positive reviews and is as riveting as the first. All of Professor Eire's books, both his memoirs and his academic books on the Reformation, are banned in Cuba, where he has been proclaimed an enemy of the state, a distinction he regards as the highest of all honors. There is much more that might be said about Professor Eire's fascinating life and distinguished career. But for now, Carlos Eire, welcome. We are so pleased and excited to have you with us this evening.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me to join you. It's a real privilege.
Carlos, we're interested tonight especially in your dual identity. On the one hand, as Cuban native and exile. On the other hand, as Protestant Reformation historian and scholar. With that in mind, I want to begin with an intriguing address you gave some years ago as president of the American Society of Reformation Research, an address in which you stated that your career as an historian of the 16th century Protestant Reformation was influenced decisively by your own 20th century experience as a young child of the Castro regime's persecution of the Catholic Church in Cuba. And the influence in your account had something to do with iconoclasm in both the 16th and 20th centuries. Carlos, could you explain what this is all about? What do you mean by iconoclasm? How did your experience as a child in Cuba shape your career as an historian of the Protestant Reformation?
Yeah, well, it's difficult to wrap it all up quickly, but my iconoclasm, my interest in iconoclasm, stems from the fact that as a child, I witnessed, I saw, and I heard the destruction of religious symbols just 2 blocks from my house in Havana, when a former Ursuline convent, of course, the nuns had been chased away and the government had taken over the building, and they were very busily destroying all the crosses and all the religious gewgaws that were on the exterior of the building. And of course, as a Catholic, I had been brought up to revere and fear religious imagery, sacred imagery. So this destruction struck me as at a very inchoate way, at a very deep level. As a child, to me, this was something that just kind of embodied this revolution that was going on, that was changing everything and changing it for the worse. So then later on, I decided when I was a sophomore in high school that I wanted to be a historian. And I ended up doing Reformation because I saw so many things, not just the iconoclasm, but I saw so many parallels between the onset of the Protestant Reformation and what I had lived through. I felt like I had a kind of visceral understanding of what happened in the 16th century. And it took me a while, but I eventually discovered that this visceral understanding I had of what went on in the Reformation made my approach to it somewhat different, if not very different, from that of everyone else around me who was studying the same period.
And
I should add.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to add that, I was reared to venerate and fear religious images. As a child, they scared me, those religious images. So I also understood the Protestant iconoclasts' desire to get rid of these very scary things.
And what you seem to be saying, too, is that the destruction of these religious images by the Castro regime was to some degree involved the destruction of idols that you thought in some sense needed, as scary as they might have been, needed to be venerated and needed to be respected. And there was a deeply destructive dimension in this activity from your perspective, because really the way you, in your account, what was being destroyed here were not simply religious images and icons in some narrow sense of the term, but it was an attack on religion and religious experience as such in Cuba. Now and that had something to do with the Marxist view of religion. Could you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Religion was a challenge to the totalitarian authority being set up by the Castro regime. And, the Marxist creed that religion is the opiate of the people blinds them to the truth being, in Marxist terms, that the real history, all there is to history, is social struggle, class conflict, and that social and economic issues are the determining factors of life, period. Forget about any transcendent dimension or any afterlife. As a child, I could understand, not just because of what adults were saying around me, but because of what I saw going on, that in fact, the world was being reduced in my neighborhood in Havana. The world was being reduced to the here and now, and there's nothing more except for the maximum leader and everything the maximum leader has to say about class conflict, blah, blah, blah. So I understood, even as a child, that Marx was a replacement. Marx but more importantly, the living being, Fidel Castro, was replacing God. And I didn't take too kindly to that.
And you said that later on, interestingly enough, when you ended up going to graduate school, you found, somewhat surprisingly perhaps, that there was a vision of history being done that reminded you of some of the experiences that you had as a child in Cuba, and reminded you of the Marxist vision of religion. That is to say, people were arguing that religion in its own right didn't really have any causal role in human history. That could you say a little bit more about what's going on there?
Sure.
What happened when you showed up in graduate school, and how this sort of reminded you of some of the things earlier? Yeah.
In the early 70s, social history began to displace intellectual history. So ideas, it wasn't just religion, it was ideas. But religion, even more so than ideas, was considered an epiphenomenon, never the real thing. I mean, you could explain everything that people did concerning their religious lives, or everything in religion in people's lives, that could be explained as a side effect of economic, political, and social issues. So belief had no real substance to it. Granted, belief doesn't have substance, because belief is immaterial. It's in our heads, it's in our hearts, metaphorically. But belief is as a real thing that can motivate people. Belief is something that can bring about change. Belief is something that can shape the world. Was being not just disregarded, but in many ways being swept aside as useless conceit. And I had to struggle against this early on in my career. It was very difficult for me to get my first book published on iconoclasm because, as the archivist of the city of Basel in Switzerland said to me, he said, "So, this is what you want to do? What is there to say? The images were here one day, the next day they were gone. So what?" Well, I guess that's one way of seeing it. The images were there one day and they were gone the next, but it doesn't help to explain, to get to the reality of why those images went up in the first place and why they were taken down. So, I saw studies of iconoclasm that blamed the whole thing on grain prices. So that irritated me. Knowing very differently, knowing that Marxism itself is an ideology and a belief system that is akin to religion, if not identical to it in many instances.
So in a certain sense, Carlos, among contemporary historians of the Reformation, you are something, some irony here, you are something of an iconoclast yourself. I found striking the remarks of one reviewer of your book, Reformations, a man named Nicholas Terpstra, I believe, University of Toronto, where he says, in recent years, that is Carlos Eire, you, has adopted the posture of the outsider, an interpreter out of step with the dominant historiographical consensus, and quite unapologetically so. And I take it what he means is that you are one who wants to insist that religious experience, religious conviction, religious belief has its own causal role to play in historical explanation, and it cannot be reduced without remainder to other things like social class or race or gender or those sorts of things. That kind of reductionism is what you're trying to resist in your role as iconoclast in the contemporary field of Reformation history. So on the one hand,
Yes.
while you have been one who has wanted to sort of preserve the religious integrity of icons and religious experience in a certain sense, on the other hand, on the contemporary scene, you are something of an iconoclast in the academy. And here we're just speaking metaphorically now, iconoclast in the sense that you are raising some critical questions about things that are just assumed among contemporary practitioners of Reformation history. Is that a fair characterization? Yeah.
That's very fair. But I should add, though, that I'm not saying that all these other factors don't play a role in history. I'm just, as you said it, you put it beautifully, reductionism is what I'm opposed to. Finding a monocausal explanation for whatever. Life is complicated. History is complicated. I found out in a very, very real way while reading and tallying the results of last wills and testaments from 16th century Madrid, that the money that people spent on masses for their souls and the souls of their dear departed ones actually did, in a very real way, not just shape religion, but shape life. So the price of a mass and the price of bread went up together with inflation. And that affected everything together. History is a complex thing, and reductionism is one of the worst mistakes that any historian can, trap that any historian can fall into. So, yeah, I don't like to take down the idols of people who are reductionists, because I think that those idols they have, which are, a way of reducing everything to one explanation, they play a role. They do play a role, and they're real. So I guess I don't smash that. Come to think of it, I don't smash those images. I do what the Dutch did after a certain point. The Dutch Calvinists, they stopped destroying the Catholic images because they realized they were worth money. So instead of destroying the images, the Dutch iconoclasts saved them very carefully and sold them to Catholics because they were going to hell anyway. So
that's interesting. Carlos, that's great. Again, speaking metaphorically, you present yourself as an iconoclast in another more general sense, in the sense that you hold political and moral views not typically held by college and university professors and students, who in your account, if I might put it this way, sort of speaking generally, tend to lean left or liberal, and you are critical of those more commonly held leftist or liberal views. You're an iconoclast in that sense. Now, I don't mean to say that you're conservative across the board, but you have some conservative convictions and other liberal convictions, but you are, in some sense, a kind of critic in that respect. You stand out in that respect. Right. Now, let's start with U.S. policy toward Cuba, and particularly as that is reflected in the last two presidential administrations. So, former President Obama normalized U.S. diplomatic relations with Cuba and eased restrictions on travel, trade, and financial transaction between the two countries. This is often referred to as the Cuban thaw, the dehelo cubano, or the warming up of U.S.-Cuba relations. I might mention that in the spring, I think of 2016, St. Olaf College sent the jazz band down to Cuba. They had a wonderful time, and this was part of this sort of opening things up. President Trump has chilled things a bit, reimposed some of these restrictions as recently as last month. Some have said that Trump was just pitching to Cuban Americans for political reasons. I mean, what are your views on all of this? I mean, you have some pretty strong views. And how do your views compare with the views of your colleagues at Yale or in the academy more generally?
Yeah, well, on the Cuba issue, I mean, I can't help but have nothing but horrible, terrible memories about what happened in Cuba and what continues to happen in Cuba, because I keep close eye on it on a daily basis. Totalitarianism is an awful thing. Anyone who has read Orwell's 1984 or Orwell's Animal Farm need read no further. That will explain Cuba to them, both of those books. That's what Cuba is. So Obama's opening to Cuba was a shameless vanity policy of his. Yeah, he mouthed all these platitudes about this opening up Cubans, and it didn't open anything. Repression actually increased in Cuba after the opening, and there are statistics to prove that. Repression got worse in Cuba, because what you have there is a 60-year-old dynastic regime / military junta of the old-fashioned Latin American type, much worse military junta than there ever was in Chile or Argentina in terms of human rights abuses. And they took advantage of it, the rulers. They own everything. The military owns everything in Cuba. There really is no private property. The only people who own anything, and put quotation marks around that, are the oligarchs who run the place, the small, like probably less than 1% of the population, and the military who own everything. They profit from every tourist that visits Cuba. They own the entire tourist industry. Yeah, they share the profits with the European firms that built and run the hotels. But in fact, it is, I use the word, and I don't use it lightly, an apartheid tourist system. Because the foreigners who go to Cuba get to enjoy all sorts of things, including rights and privileges that are denied to the natives. And up until fairly recently, actually, Cubans were forbidden from setting foot in any of these tourist facilities. So opening Cuba up, so to speak, just put more money in the pockets of the military junta that runs the place. And I compare it, try to compare it often, see if anyone can understand. Back when South Africa was practicing apartheid and it became unfashionable or even considered immoral to travel to South Africa. That's how I view travel to Cuba. I think anyone who is not going to Cuba to help people, either financially or materially, or to help upset the totalitarian system, and is going there to enjoy themselves and have a good time, that, in my book, to my mind, is just as immoral, perhaps even more so, than it was considered to be to travel to South Africa back in the apartheid days.
Interesting.
So that doesn't sit very well with many people.
Yeah, that's for sure. A related matter, you weren't happy with Pope Francis and the way Pope Francis has comported himself in relationship to the Castro regime in Cuba. Could you say something about that?
Sure. I mean, I'm all in favor of taking care of the poor, focusing on the poor, focusing on poverty, and so on. But Pope Francis always has very nasty comments to make about capitalist materialism. But he has yet to have a single nasty word to say about regimes like the Castro regime and other Marxist dictators in Latin America who oppress their people, all in the name of, quote unquote, liberation theology. So I really mean no disrespect. I mean no disrespect, but I jokingly, because I went to a Jesuit school and I understand Jesuits, I call him Papa Che. Most people don't know that Che is the Argentinian equivalent of dude. But of course, everybody knows who Che Guevara was. So I think it's proper to call him Papa Che. The image that stands out in my mind is when Evo Morales, the dictator of Bolivia, gave him a crucifix in the shape of a hammer and sickle, with Christ nailed to a hammer and sickle. And he just accepted it and took it back to the Vatican. And, that was a perfect opportunity, I thought, to say, hey, Evo, this isn't right, This is not what Catholicism or Christianity is all about. But no, he lets it slide. I think he's been infected by leftist liberation theology a bit too much. He closes an eye to all the abuses that come from totalitarian leftist regimes.
Permit me this, Carlos. I'm going to put on my devil's advocate hat for a moment.
Sure.
And a few weeks ago, we had someone in who identified herself as a Marxist, and I put on my capitalist devil's advocate hat. Here I'm going to put on my Marxist devil's advocate hat and put a question to you. I can imagine someone might say, you are a bourgeois or middle-class casualty of a communist revolution. You were a member of a relatively privileged class in Cuba. Maybe not the real top, but you were doing pretty well. The revolution came, the privileged class lost its privileges, property was redistributed as a matter of egalitarian social justice, so the Marxists would argue. Your complaints then are the complaints of a formerly privileged class that has lost its privileges. How would you respond to that?
The first thing I would say is that it's not about stuff. It's not about material stuff. It's about the fact that Marxist regimes try to steal your soul and your mind, and they try to take over. Almost like the 1950s science fiction film, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. They want you to stop being yourself and thinking for yourself. That is the absolute worst thing. And, I could go through a long list of people I know who came from the bottom class, who actually, lived in houses out in the country with dirt floors, who were very, very eager and desperate to leave Cuba and risk their lives on rafts out in the ocean. More poor people have fled Cuba than rich people ever did. There are 2 million Cubans in exile or more. And the population of Cuba is 11 million. Do the math. Could there have been 2 million rich people in Cuba? No, of course not. Cuba had a large middle class, one of the largest in Latin America in 1958. But it didn't have that. I'm amused always by the irrationality of the charge made against me being privileged and leaving Cuba, and of all those who left Cuba as being privileged, because on the one hand, these are people who say, well, the problem in Cuba was that everyone was poor. Everyone was poor, and there were only a few rich people. But then you end up with 2 million people leaving the island. So, it's not about property or class or anything. My grandfather, who was a poor Spanish immigrant, who saved money all his life and was ready to retire, lost everything he had saved in one day thanks to Che Guevara, who nationalized all the banks and took everyone's money. My grandparents were poor. My mother's parents were poor. Immigrants who never actually made it. And they lost everything. So, although one side of my family was better off, one side of my family was poor. So, it was not about stuff. Never has been about stuff. Except for maybe for some of the very, very few who were genuinely rich, like the Van Hool family, who now own the entire sugar business in Florida. But they took precautions, and they stashed their money outside of Cuba and didn't actually lose it.
Thank you. You also, we're moving a bit now, you also characterize yourself more generally as an iconoclast or critic with respect to what you and others identify more generally as political correctness in the contemporary academy, today's colleges and universities. So that besides matters related to U.S.-Cuba relations, there are other idols or icons that dominate the American, American academy, colleges and universities today. These idols or icons related to political correctness need smashing of sort because they prevent freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry on college and university campuses. In an article in the Yale Daily News published last December, some of which was reported on shortly after by the Wall Street Journal, you are quoted as follows. Yale, this is a direct quotation now, Yale talks a lot of diversity, but basically all that diversity means here is skin color. That's a quotation attributed to you, Eire said. Yes. There's definitely no diversity here when it comes to politics. The liberal point of view is taken to be objective, not an opinion, not a set of beliefs. And the articles, both the Yale Daily News and the Wall Street Journal article goes on in a characterization of you and your views. I mean, could you say a little bit more about the leftist idols that you think are out there that get in the way of genuine freedom of expression in the academy?
Sure. Of course, everyone knows what political correctness means. But knowing what it means and having to live with it and having to watch your mouth all the time and having to be careful and not actually speak your mind because there will be bad consequences. Not just ostracism or ridicule, but actual bad consequences, such as, for instance, I read a few weeks ago a case of an adjunct professor somewhere who had fallen asleep during a Zoom meeting on diversity and inclusion. And students spotted her falling asleep. So students wrote to the administration of this college and demanded that this adjunct professor be fired for falling asleep. The whole idea, we've crossed the line now. It's worse than political correctness. This whole silence and violence business, that is straight out of the worst totalitarian nightmare that anyone can imagine. That it's not what you say, it's what you don't say, right? That's how carefully you have to watch your language. Here at Yale, a few Halloweens ago, about this time of year, some of my colleagues, one of my colleagues got in really bad hot water, real trouble with the students, because she dared to question an order that had gone out from some other dean about Halloween costumes and about, hey, you better not wear any Halloween costumes that are appropriate other people's cultures, blah, blah, blah. And my colleague wrote a letter to the Yale Daily saying, look, we're all adults here. And if you disagree with costumes, is there any better chance to talk about these issues? But we're all adults. We understand what's going on. Anyway, this person, again, the students demanded that she be fired. So this is what we live with, and this is what I live with, and what I have to put up with every day. I think I've had many bad moments where I've had to bite my tongue and not say what I think. But again, I don't want to be painted into a corner. I don't want to be painted as some kind of reactionary, and I want people to understand I'm saying all these things. But, I'm all in favor of social services. I'm in favor of the poor gaining steps up to out of their poverty and so on and so forth. And in my own family here as exiles, I've been on food stamps. My mother was on not just Medicaid, but welfare. My brother too, up to the end of their lives. And thank God for that. I'm not for, pulling out the social safety net. What I object to about the leftism that's taken over higher education is this attempt to clamp down on expression and to change buildings' names kind of at random. We had a building, the name was changed from Calhoun College, could not be named after John Calhoun because of his views on slavery. However, the other 12 residential colleges at Yale, most of them are named after people with equally reprehensible opinions, but it's selectively cherry-picked. We have a college named after Samuel Morse, the inventor of the Morse code, who was a virulent anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant and actually ran for mayor of New York on the anti-immigrant ticket. Yet nobody calls for the removal of his name from Morse College. So I also detect a lot of hypocrisy in all of this political correctness. It's all very selective to follow a certain ideological path that happens to be in style or in fashion. So now,
okay.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, just a related matter. We mentioned in the introduction that all of your books, including not just your memoirs, but your academic works on the Reformation, are banned formally in Cuba. So there you have legal, official, political censorship, and obviously, given your points of view, and given the points of view, I think, of any liberal in the large sense of the term, this is going to be a problematic matter. But you have also experienced the kind of social censorship in American academic and journalistic contexts, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about those experiences. So, for example, you had some kind of disagreement with the New York Times, who solicited an essay from you or some kind of commentary from you, and you wrote the piece. It was on Cuba, and then you were asked to revise it or something along those lines. Could you say something about that experience?
Yeah, the New York Times contacted me when Fidel Castro fell ill and it looked like he was going to die. They contacted me and point blank asked me to write an op-ed criticizing those awful Cubans in Miami who were dancing in the streets because Fidel was sick. How awful of them. Because after all, said the New York Times editor, he had allowed them to leave with his blessing. So I wrote back and I said, yeah, I'll write an essay for you, but it's not going to be this one. How about this for an essay that, Fidel Castro was the best pupil that Niccolo Machiavelli ever had, who actually mastered the art of being loved and feared at the same time. Oh, no, that's not right. They wanted me to criticize my own people, which is the oldest trick in the book, which, segregationists used to play all the time back in the 1960s to get African Americans to criticize their fellow African Americans who were being a little too uppity. So that upset me. I was disinvited from the University of Wisconsin once because, and I quote, I remember it word for word, I couldn't be allowed on campus because I was representing the oppression of the Cuban people by the exile community. And then I've had one essay I wrote on Cuba that I spent an entire summer working on, rejected for publication for the most transparent of political reasons. And I was accused of being biased and lacking a critical viewpoint.
What was the essay?
In other words, I had no nice things to say about the Cuban Revolution. The article was entitled "From Cha-Cha-Cha to Che-Che-Che." Something like, deconstructing the new something or another. I forget the rest of the title, but basically deconstructing the new white man's burden. Because I think there is a very, very strong element of latent and sometimes blatant racism behind non-Cubans who are light-skinned, who have nice things to say about the Cuban Revolution. It's okay for them. That's the best they can hope for. It's okay for them. Oh, no, I wouldn't live there for 5 minutes. No, I wouldn't want to live there, but it's okay for them. It's the best they can hope for. I've heard this so many times, so many times. I'm not making this up.
Could we go back to religion just for a moment? One of the most striking moments in your memoirs, both of them, as I'm recalling now, is your reference to the work, The Imitation of Christ by St. Thomas à Kempis. This was a book written in the 15th century, so about 100 years before the Reformation. But you said in the memoirs that this was a book that frightened you as a child, but was crucial to your spiritual survival as an exile. It seems to me this connects in some way with some of the things you were saying earlier about religion and religious experience as an important role in people's lives, having causal efficacy and so forth. Could you say something about, first of all, why did this book frighten you when you were a child? And how did you change such that this became an important book, essential to your spiritual survival as an exile?
Yeah, well, the backstory is when we left Cuba, we were only allowed to take 3 changes of clothing, 1 hat, 1 coat, 1 pair of shoes, and 1 book. And my parents chose the book. And they gave me The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, which is a really scary book for a 10 or 11-year-old because it's all about letting go of the world, letting go of yourself, not thinking of yourself, but giving yourself completely over to God and actually constantly being in conflict with the values of the world, the materialistic values of the world. So it's about being non-materialist, being a spiritual person and letting go of all material things, including your own comfort. So I found those passages immensely troubling. But then when I was in my early teens, about 14 or so, I kept reading the book because after I outgrew my clothing, it was the only item I had that had been touched by my parents, whom I missed terribly. It was their book. So I'd always try to read from it, but it scared me. But it started to make sense to me. It started to make sense to me that, Jesus is not scary because he's up on a cross. That's not the really scary thing, the bloody Jesus on the cross. It's the world that's scary. It's the world that's scary, and it's the materialism of the world that's scary. And it's the materialism of the world in general, not just the capitalist world. But the materialism of the Marxist world is soul annihilating. It doesn't concern itself whatsoever with the spiritual. But it was that book that allowed me to let go completely of whatever it was that I had lost, including my family, right? And it also, at the moment that I let go, thanks to that book, I started to realize that when I was praying, I was not talking to myself, that someone was listening, that there is something more to life than living in this world, that there is a God, that Jesus, it became very real to me at that age, at 14, what that cross meant, what salvation meant. What was I being saved from? As a child, I couldn't understand what I was being saved from. By 14, I knew what I was being saved from. And it was that book. But I'll tell you now, when I go back and I try to look at that book every time I pick it up, it is a scary book because it requires you to totally divest yourself of attachment to the world. And that is a tall order to follow, which is, how Jesus lived. That's the imitation of Christ. But finding a transcendent dimension to life requires letting go.
Powerful.
And that's a hard lesson.
It's a powerful message that you convey in the memoirs. And there's one moment in the memoir that it just will stick with me for a long time. And that is your recounting of your mother's death and being at her side as she was dying. And you talk a lot about, in that context, the void, the experiencing of this thing called the void, a kind of nothingness, but at the same time, a sense of presence that interrupted the oppression of the void. And what, undoubtedly, this is very difficult to put in words. But can you help us understand a little more exactly what was going? There was a great moment of liberation in your account of being with your mother as she was dying in relationship to these matters. Could you say more about that?
Sure, yes, because, belief is not a two-sided coin that has the same on either side. The other side of belief is unbelief, doubt. Everybody who believes doubts. And the other side of feeling the presence of the divine is feeling the void, which any existentialist philosopher would tell you is kind of a natural human condition. Well, wow, there's nothing beyond this. Whoa, well, then we're in bad. The void constantly assailed me throughout most of my life, but it was Thomas à Kempis's book that helped me keep the void at bay, and God's grace, too. But at my mother's death, there we were. She had been divested of everything. She had lost everything so many times in her life. Her material stuff, the little bit that she had, including her thimble collection, was all gone. And there she was in this hotel room full of Cubans, her friends. And they're all reciting the rosary at breakneck speed, as Cubans usually do. And one by one, they left because, time to leave, time to go home. I was left alone with my mom. And she was supposed to last another day or so, but she didn't. Middle of the night, I was sitting there holding her hand, saying, well, I'll wait it out. And all of a sudden, I've never said this in public before, but I say it in the book, so I've already put myself out. I felt an electric shock coming from her hand to mine. And it was a shock. It was like sticking your finger in a light socket. And it coursed all through me instantaneously. And there was no void, just the opposite. Absolute tranquility, absolute peace. Absolute fulfillment for both of us, hers and mine. Very powerful message. And if it's all, some psychiatrists might say, some part of my brain misfiring in wish fulfillment or whatever, I don't care. It was a wonderful experience.
It's a powerful account in the memoir. It's one of the most moving things that I've read in many years. And you talk about that feeling of the void as a feeling of being absolutely alone, absolutely in isolation, and this presence broke through that, or broke the hold that void had on you. In this regard. And it's deeply connected with this idea of letting go too, as you characterize it in the memoir. Very, very powerful stuff. And I commend everyone listening to have a look at those texts. Very, very interesting stuff. Just one other thing before we turn to sort of general audience Q&A. In a way, it gets back to some of the things you were saying about historians, and now what you're saying about this sense of transcendence in your experience and so forth. One of the classes that have read your lecture that you made available have asked the question of what you think about miracles particularly. And you are investigating now in your research miracles in the 15th and 16th centuries, as I'm recalling. Do you think that when you say that historians have left things out in their account of things, sometimes it sounds like you're saying something, well, they just don't do intellectual history anymore. They don't focus on ideas, they focus rather on material realities and so forth. And that seems like a kind of interesting debate and an important debate to have. But at other times, it sounds like you're saying something more controversial than that, that there is a kind of reality that touches upon human experiences that one might characterize in some sense as the miraculous, that somehow needs to be part of the historical analysis of the history of religion, at any rate. I mean, are you going that far? Are you saying that professional historians need to have that as part of their ontology? They need to take that into account when they're explaining what happens in various moments in human history? They need to think, they need to be open to the possibility of miracles, I guess is the way I'm putting it.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you put it that way. You need to be open to the possibility. It's not that historians need to, certify miracles or prove that they didn't happen, but there are strange things that remain unexplained that happen in the history of religion, plural, all religions, not just the Christian religion. Strange things happen in religion. And historians, I think, should be a little more, not a little, should be more open to the possibility that some things just cannot be explained because perhaps there is another dimension, and perhaps that other dimension breaks through sometimes. Otherwise, how would you explain many things that one finds throughout history, such as what I'm working on now? Actually, I've narrowed down my miracles. I'm working on the most impossible miracle of all, levitation, which is a side effect of mystical ecstasy where people float or actually fly. The hold of gravity stops affecting them in ecstasy. Now, we have numerous accounts of levitators, and we have not just accounts from peasants who think they saw somebody fly, but we have accounts from all sorts of different people at all different social levels, including crowned monarchs who would testify that they saw so-and-so hovering. And how do you explain this? How do you explain all these testimonies? What can we make of them? Of course, historians, we put that in brackets, right? We can't say St. Joseph of Cupertino actually flew. No, we can't say that. But we need to explain why hundreds, if not thousands of people claimed to see him floating in the air. Not inside a building, but outside, where it's very difficult to pull off a magic trick like, what's his name? Forget the magician's name, David Blaine, right? Who has a nice levitating trick on the street that you can watch on video, David Blaine, and people think he really is levitating and they freak out. No, I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about writing a history of the impossible. How do we approach the impossible? How do we write about it? And in fact, there was a 20th century levitator who was canonized not too long ago. Now he's Saint Padre Pio, an Italian priest, Capuchin, who died in 1968. And we have lots of 20th century testimonies seeing him. How do we explain all this? Well, I think it's interesting, and not only that interesting, but it raises very, very important questions about the nature of reality and how we comprehend reality, how we limit our horizons about certain possibilities. Healing miracles happen all the time. Everybody accepts this. Healing miracles are part and parcel of daily lore throughout the world. And actually at the Vatican, when they're putting somebody up for canonization and they need miracles, they usually look, the office that directs researching the miracles, what they look for is an atheist physician or scientist who can say I have no way of explaining this. Modern medicine, modern science has no way of explaining this, but it's undeniable. It happened. So it happens. You know, not to rely on personal anecdotes, but my wife and I were given a 0% chance of ever having children. 0. Actually, the doctor was kind to us. He said 0.01%. And, well, we have 3 kids. Is that a miracle? You bet. In my book, if that doesn't count as a miracle, I should resign from my profession.
That's interesting, controversial, and something that I'm sure our audience will take on for further reflection. I think now is a good time for us to move to general audience questions, and we have some that are available to us via video. And could we have the first question then, please?
Hi, my name's Maddie, and I'm a junior in Reformation theology. And my question is, how does the intersectionality of your identities allow you to learn and teach about the Reformation from a unique perspective?
Well, I'm not sure I know what intersectionality means in this respect, but I take it multiple identities is what's being asked. And yeah, it helps me to see things that others might not see who have never witnessed or lived through a revolution. And the Reformation was a revolution, no doubt about it. I mean, in Protestant Catholic polemics, of course, Protestants never called themselves a revolution, but Catholics always called Protestants rebels and called their movement a revolution or a revolt. There was a total upending of a system that had been in place for nearly a millennium. So that counts as a revolution. Having lived through one makes you see things from a different perspective compared to people who have not lived through one. So, and also having grown up in a culture that was ostensibly 88% Catholic, and then moving to a culture where Catholics are a small minority in most places. Not in Stearns County, Minnesota. There, for the first time in the United States, my life in the United States, I was living in a county where the majority was Catholic, and that was a new experience for me.
Thank you, Carlos. Next question, please.
While researching the topics of your talk today, I came across numerous articles about iconoclasm and its presence in the Black Lives Matter movement. For example, the removal or destruction of statues of Western figures such as General Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general in Richmond, Virginia, or of Winston Churchill in England. One article described the utility of iconoclasm in Black Lives Matter as a force of mass mobilization and as a signal of imminent regime change. I wanted to hear your thoughts on the relevance and maybe importance of iconoclasm in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Black Lives Matter movement is employing a tool that Protestant reformers employed too. And actually, what happened in Geneva in 1535 is a lesson parallel to Black Lives Matter. In Geneva, it was children who led the iconoclast crusade in the main church of St. Peter's in Geneva. And they smashed the images. And then they took pieces from those images and they went out to the street and started pelting people with those broken pieces of images. And what they said was, here we have the gods of the priests. Would you like some? And then whack. They throw something at you. The gods of the priests. This has happened throughout history. Images represent a certain order. And they not only represent that order, but they represent the people who maintain that order, the priests, be they who they may. And that's what the Black Lives iconoclasm is all about. This is why It's not just in the United States, but, Argentina got rid of all of its Columbus statues, too. So I can see why Confederate statues would offend someone. In Mexico City last week, they erected 2 statues, one of Fidel Castro and one of Che Guevara, sitting next to each other on a park bench. Am I offended? Yes. If I ever go to Mexico City, first place I'll visit is a hardware store, buy a sledgehammer, and smash those 2 sons of bitches. I understand iconoclasm, and so do the Black Lives Matter people.
Thank you, Carlos. Next question, please.
Could the current Cuban government realistically enact any political or societal reforms to make you comfortable with countries such as the United States normalizing relationships completely with it? Or would there have to be a complete regime change overthrowing the communist government?
It would have to be a complete regime change. Those people in charge are not going to change anything. For 60 years, they've had a chance to change everything. Instead, they just keep doubling down on the same old stuff. They own everything. They want to keep owning everything. They own everybody, too, not just the things. They own the people who are their slaves. And they're not going to give that up. And no, I don't think anybody should have relations with Cuba. No one. They should just do to Cuba what was done to South Africa in times of apartheid. And look how quickly that fixed things there.
Thank you, Carlos. Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Natalie, and I'm a sophomore at St. Olaf College taking Reformation theology. I'm curious, how has your academic study of these Protestant and Catholic religious revolutions influenced and shaped your own personal faith?
Well, that's a great question. I think, I'd have to answer it by going backwards, is that I know one of the reasons I went to study Protestants was my experience of changing cultures coming to the United States. And I'm fascinated by the way in which beliefs shape behavior. So I come to the United States, and who's my first foster family? My first foster family is Jewish, right? And they force me on Sundays to go to a Catholic church because that's what my parents would have wanted. At that age, I would have much rather gone to the park or something else rather than go to church, but they forced me to go to church. And then I end up in Bloomington, Illinois, a very Protestant town. And who helps us? It's the Protestant churches, the Presbyterians and the Methodists especially. So I realized at that point, without even thinking about being a scholar, that there is something about the ethics of Protestants, as well as the ethics of Jews, that makes them good people. So all the theological differences, yes, they play a role for me. I'm a Catholic, and I'm a very comfortable Catholic. But I like understanding the other Christians. I like understanding Jews. I like understanding Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, whatever. I like understanding atheists. My Jewish foster father proclaimed himself an atheist. And he was so nice to me, so ethical, that even as a 11-year-old, I processed it. Here's an atheist who's a Jew who doesn't even believe in Christ, and he's being nicer to me than most Christians. So going to study the differences between Catholics and Protestants has helped me. It's kind of almost like psychotherapy, put things in perspective, why the world is the way it is, as well as giving me some clue as to how the world should be, and give me hope for the future that perhaps, the world could be a much nicer place, thanks to religion.
Thank you, Carlos. Next question.
Hi, Mr. Eire. I'm Maxwell Rubin, a senior, a political science and Chinese major, and a student associate with the Institute for Freedom and Community. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. Given your description of the Castro regime's limit on religious freedom and practice, as well as your interpretation of the Protestant Reformation allowing for more secularization of thought and rationalization, do you see similar patterns playing out in today's American society that limit, alter, or seek to dismantle traditional religion? If so, what should people and defenders of faith do to preserve the role of religion in American life? Thank you.
Wow. Well, that's a big series of questions all bundled together. But basically, yes, I do see constant efforts that impinge on people's practice of religion here in the United States, but it usually has to do with ethical issues. Not with issues of belief, but ethical issues. And of course, the biggest and most troublesome of all of these issues revolve around life and death. Abortion, euthanasia, so on and so forth. Should Catholics be forced to, Catholics who work in the medical profession be forced to perform abortions if it's against their conscience, against their beliefs, or not even just perform, but should they be penalized for not doing it? Of course not. But we constantly run into this, and we'll keep running into it over and over again because there is a disconnect between certain Christian values, and not all Christians share the same opinion on issues like abortion and euthanasia. But we will keep running into these time and time again, and I think what people of faith need to do is to stand their ground and say, no, you can't do this. This is not what's guaranteed by the United States Constitution under freedom of religion. You can't do this, and push back as much as you can. I'm not saying that Christians need to force their views on everyone else. Far from it. But they should stand their ground if they have certain beliefs, not to be forced to go against these beliefs.
Yeah, Carlos, if I could follow up a bit on that. You mentioned abortion. You had written a piece some years ago about the situation in Ireland. There I thought, correct me if I'm wrong, that you were taking a somewhat stronger view on the abortion question than maybe you are taking here now in the conversation. That is to say, you thought that there wasn't sufficient conversation about the implications of liberalizing abortion laws for a general concern about universal human rights, as I'm recalling part of your argument. Am I remembering that correctly, or was something else going on in that piece?
Well, there were several things going on. I was asked to write that piece because there was a vote coming up in Ireland, a predominantly Catholic country, to liberalize abortion to a greater degree. And I wrote the piece because Ireland is a Catholic country. It's a Catholic culture. And I did think that there was enough attention being paid. But of course, from a distance, I wasn't in Ireland. I wasn't living through it. But as an outside observer, it seemed to me that perhaps, the rights of the unborn, as a Catholic, I believe in the rights of the unborn. So I stand for that. And I stood for that in this essay addressed to a largely Catholic audience, even if only nominally Catholic, right?
You wouldn't be saying then that in the United States, that has the First Amendment and religious freedom and so forth, you wouldn't be making the same kind of appeal here.
Oh, it would be impossible to make the same kind of appeal here because it has, as I see it as a Catholic, unfortunately, it's the law of the land. And I realize how awful a decision it is that everyone has to make in cases where there's an unwanted pregnancy, right? I understand, and I understand a woman's rights to her own body and so on and so forth. But what I'm saying is that there's an exchange taking place here. An exchange, a human life is being exchanged for whatever else the other thing is. And I always find that very sad, extremely sad.
Thank you. Next question then.
Hi, my name is Claire Mueller. I am a junior at St. Olaf. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on how icons have changed and become modernized, and if our definition of an icon relates to what it once was. I guess I'm thinking of, and this could be my own background, like you mentioned in your writing, that all of our experience really impacts the way that we think about the world. And so in my own personal experience, I don't have a lot of interaction with religious icons, but I think that through social media or even the celebrities, you hear the word icon and you think of someone famous. So I was just wondering if you could kind of address how icon in itself has changed as we've become modernized. Thank you.
Yeah, well, there's a secular meaning to icon that we apply. Even objects are now icons. Something is iconic, like an iconic shoe or something. The meaning has changed, but icon as sacred image is one thing. Icon as a cultural image, that's very different. And, a rock star can be an icon. An opera singer can be an icon. A bottle of Coca-Cola can be an icon. We use the term very loosely. But a sacred image, that's something very different. And again, we're on a spectrum. If you think of it as a spectrum, like the light spectrum, at one end, you have people who believe that sacred images really are the presence of the sacred or divine. And at the other end and in between, you've got different takes on how present is the sacred here. How does this connect me to the sacred? And then you get to the other extreme, and you have people who might have religious images that offer no connection to the sacred to them, yet they still like to have them around. Like all those St. Francis cement statues that one sees in garden centers. I wonder who's buying all these St. Francis statues, right? Do they know what that represents or what it means to them? I think one brings one's own baggage to icons, be they cultural or sacred. And they have a special meaning to the individual. And they can also have a special meaning culturally in general. Like, for instance, the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe has a very, very special meaning to Mexicans, right? That it can't have the same meaning to Catholics of other nationalities. Not the same way. So we change our attitude towards icons. And notice that when there are auctions of celebrity items, things that were once owned by Elvis, for instance, they fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, because people have attachment to these reminders of what has gone, what is missing. And that's what religious images are.
Thank you, Carlos. I think we have one more video question.
Hello,
Okay.
I'm Mari. I'm a sophomore and I'm in Reformation theology right now. And I was wondering, what do you think an iconoclastic movement would look like now with the advent of social media? Do you think it would change, or do you think it'd be similar to what we've seen in the past?
Oh, great question. Because in fact, with social media, the previous question I had about Black Lives Matter and their iconoclasm, and they're not the only ones. The Antifa people are also into iconoclasm. And even people who are not affiliated with any of these groups are tearing down images right and left, not just of Confederate generals or Christopher Columbus, but I've seen statues of President Grant toppled, one of Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson. Everybody's getting toppled on social media, and people are capturing this. One of the most frightening things I've seen in the past 2 weeks is the riot in Santiago, Chile, where two churches were attacked by protesters, looted, images taken out to the street and burned, and then the churches themselves were set on fire. And all this was filmed on phones and broadcast on social media. And the one church where the steeple, a very old 19th century church in Santiago, the steeple came crashing down, and people were hooting and howling and cheering and clapping, and all of this is recorded for the world to see. So yeah, Protestant iconoclasts had a much smaller audience. Yet they knew that what they were doing was a very, very powerful way of ushering in change.
Thank you, Carlos. Now we have some questions that have come to us online, and I will just be reading them to you. This is from Jake Olson, sophomore class from St. Olaf. What do you believe Cuban citizens can do in order to reduce restrictions and censorship in the Cuban government?
Cuban people can do nothing, because the minute they set their foot or hand forward to try to make any change, they are silenced, imprisoned, or in several cases, the more prominent ones, you usually die in an accident, quote unquote. No one in the United States can understand what it's like to live in a totalitarian regime where making change is impossible. And really pressing for change constantly will cost you your life. And usually, also, this is the most insidious part, the lives of your family. They come after them. And they threaten you, not just with your own death, but all the horrible things that will be done to your family. And they have full 100% control, still do. Things have gotten worse and worse and worse. So, no, there's nothing that Cuban people can do other than all 11 million of them rising up at the very same time and overpowering the thugs who keep them in control. But keep in mind, in Cuba, only the state police and only the military can own weapons.
Thank you, Carlos. Another question, this is from Caden Boughton, class of 2024. In what religion is iconoclasm most present? Why do you think it is most present in that religion?
Oh, wow. Well, let me make a distinction here. Iconoclasm as the destruction of religious images is one thing. Not having images, being an-iconic, is a different thing. Islam and Judaism are very an-iconic. You don't want to have representations of the divine, or even very, very specific representations, for instance, in Islam, of the Prophet Muhammad. It's forbidden. And this is because these religions have a sense of the divine as so transcendent and otherworldly that they cannot even fathom having images as objects of veneration. So that's an aniconic religion. But we saw, for instance, in ISIS in Syria and in other places where ISIS took over a couple years ago, we saw some Muslims in ISIS being iconoclasts. They were destroying all religious images, regardless of what religion those images represented. Even ancient religions that are no longer in existence. They just didn't want to have any images. So they destroyed priceless treasures for religious reasons. That's because their religions have it as one of their main tenets that you cannot represent the divine or the sacred. Christianity, in contrast, the incarnation. God became a man. God became a man, Jesus of Nazareth. This has been the Christian argument for images since the first century. God already made himself material. And the argument formulated in the 7th century, especially by John of Damascus, was that by becoming incarnate, God transformed matter. God transformed material things, gave him a spiritual value that allows us to have images as reminders of the sacred or as windows onto the sacred. So, but Christians have been iconoclasts. In the Eastern Christian tradition in the 7th and 8th century, and especially, there was an iconoclastic movement. And Protestants, not Lutherans, but the Reformed Protestant tradition and other Protestant traditions later became very iconoclastic, interpreting the second commandment literally. Thou shalt have no graven images.
Thank you, Carlos. This question from Religion, St. Olaf course, Religion 255, Beauty, Arts, Religion, instructor Petter Javan. Our religion class is looking at the connection between art and religion. One text we've read argues that one way to resacralize or re-enchant the world, because of your suggestion that, like Weber, Luther, and other Protestants disenchanted it, is to see all types of art, including Mark Rothko's work, through a scriptural imagination. Here you see human creativity through the lens of a loving Trinitarian God. Do you think that such a re-enchantment is possible, or are we left ever disenchanted?
No, I think it's definitely possible, but you have to always take into consideration the context in which that re-sacralization is taking place. It's very hard for that to take place in a religious tradition that's aniconic. But I can see that happening, yes. And to a certain extent, in our highly secular culture, art in general, the arts, plural, have become semi-sacred. Go to any big museum on a Sunday, and it'll usually be thronged. And what are these people doing there on Sunday? Most of them are probably there rather than at church because they experience something transcendent. As someone once put it to me, transcendence can mean many things, including blowing out a spit valve. If you're in the orchestra and you've just performed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, that can be transcendence. And I thought that was a beautiful statement. Yes, absolutely. But you have to be part of a community that appreciates this, to have people to share it with.
This question from another course, Religion 285, What is Religion? Instructor Greg Walter. Eire is investigating Reformation era attitudes toward miracles. What are Eire's criteria for miracles? I wonder if he agrees with Tave's specialness ascription model. We have worked with Anne Taves. We have worked with Anne Taves, reconsidering religious experience, and she wants to identify the miraculous as singular or unique events. We ask this question especially since we presume that what counts as a miracle has changed between the Reformation and now. So what counts as a miracle?
Well, yeah. From my perspective, a miracle is an eruption of the spiritual, sacred, or divine. An eruption spelled E-R-R, I-R-R rather than E-R. Quite often editors correct me and they change my eruptions into eruptions, but an eruption or a breaking through, breaking forth of this other dimension in a way that amazes or changes things, amazes people or changes things, or can do both at the same time, like, Jesus changing water into wine. If that isn't a miracle, then what is? The Protestant reformers, Calvin especially, like to argue that the miracles we read about in the New Testament ceased to happen when the last of the apostles died, because the purpose of these miracles that we read about in the New Testament was to convince people that Jesus was divine, that he was God, that he was the Savior, and that his apostles had this power from him. But then Calvin would go on to say, and says so in many different ways in different places, the biggest miracle of all, ever, is the fact that people began to believe in Jesus. And so much of the world became Christian without those miracles. So actually, Christianity itself is the biggest miracle of all, Calvin would say. And again, on a spectrum, I like to put things on spectrum. Right? You can have a miracle that's like Joseph of Cupertino, the flying friar, at one end of the spectrum, and you can have Calvin's miracle of Christianity itself being the biggest miracle of all. And everybody defines miracle differently. If you want to see a nice discussion of miracle, take a look at the film Pulp Fiction. And there's one scene in there where miracle is discussed. Beautiful, beautiful rendition of the whole discussion.
Thank you, Carlos. This question from Ben Borchardt, who's a sophomore at St. Olaf. By following the work of psychologist Jonathan Haidt and public intellectuals like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, I have become aware of some of the negative aspects of political correctness and progressive ideology that is popular on many campuses, including this one. How do you propose that I, as a student, promote open discourse and value of exploring, testing our multiple viewpoints without being ostracized by fellow students or mischaracterized politically?
Oh, wow. Now that's a tough one. That's really tough. There is no way to avoid friction, but perhaps for an individual, right, for an individual to do this is extremely difficult. One way to promote greater openness is to find at least one or two, preferably more, like-minded individuals who are upset by the lockstep mentality of having to accept a certain political creed as the absolute truth. Find other people and sponsor events where you actually have discussions, right? And where questions are asked of the sort that are being asked of me here tonight and of the other guests that this show has had. Make them as timely as possible. By that, I mean, these discussions have to be about issues that everyone is interested in at the moment, in the here and now. Not some abstract issues, but real life issues. And these discussions should help to open things up. But there's limited amount of change that any single individual can have on an entire college, for instance. So find others and rope them in to help you stage discussions.
That sounds like good advice. And get involved in the Institute for Freedom and Community, because we're interested in promoting precisely those kinds of conversations. Well, we've come.
And you've got an institute there.
We've come now to the end of our
Your
time. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just plugging your institute, saying, at St. Olaf, you've got this institute, make use of it. Yes, definitely.
Thank you. We've come now to the end of our time. Thanks to the audience for joining us tonight in this stimulating exchange with Carlos Eire, Yale University Professor of History and Religious Studies, distinguished historian of the Reformation, and author of 2 breathtaking memoirs recounting his life under the Castro regime in Cuba and as Cuban exile in the United States. And thanks so much to you, Carlos, for being with us and for sharing with us your fascinating autobiographical and vocational reflections.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you and the Institute for inviting me. It's been a wonderful evening.
The St. Olaf Institute for Freedom and Community has one more virtual event scheduled this fall. On November 10th, we will host Michael Osterholm, Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. He will address the issue of public policy and COVID-19. Learn more about this event with Michael Osterholm at institute.stolaf, that is institute.stolaf.edu. We hope you can all join us. For now, good night, be safe, and be well.